All right, guys. Well, good morning. Welcome back. It's 8:50, about 8:57. So just got a couple minutes, and then we will get into our meeting for the morning for Wednesday, September 30th. So hope you guys are doing well and comfortable and everything else. And yeah, stand by for about 3 minutes, and then we'll get started. Just hanging out with Eddie this morning. Being a good boy. Get myself a little sparkling water. I'll be right back. Okay, just another minute and a half or so, and then we'll go ahead and start. Hi, Eddie. Hello, good morning, Eva. Hey, Senna, good morning to you. Just a few of us for the moment, I guess. So numbers are starting to move a little bit. Hi, Eddie. Good morning. Welcome back, everybody. Good morning, Kelly. Hey there. All right, everyone. Just a few more seconds, and I'll get us underway. Oh yeah, not to worry, do it. I haven't cleared the queue of emails this morning. I just didn't get to my emails prior to this meeting, but right after I'm done teaching at 10:50, I have 2 sections of Philosophy 101 at Chapman here. So after 10:50, I'm going to go back in my emails and just all the messages I received, I'm going to confirm. So not to worry. But if you really want to be a triple checking and making absolutely sure, I could just have another window open right now, and I'll just let you know. All right. Hello, everybody. Haley, Lily, and everybody else. Dewey, right? Asking me. I got a lot of them in there, so you're not the only one that I need to get in touch with. Oh yeah, you sent it at 8:03. I see it there. So don't worry about it. It's there. So let me just say thanks everybody for your work on the essay. Everyone, they're due as of now. They're before class time, so ideally you've already sent it to me and it's in my inbox. Right as soon as this meeting and the one that follows right afterward is over with, I'm going to just go through the whole inbox and give everybody that sent me their essay a confirmation email. So look out for that, and you'll get that message back from me before 11:30 today. Other than that, now we've written and turned in the first essay, so thanks so much. I appreciate your work. I know you probably got a lot of things in your schedule, but now you got one essay in this class out of the way, which is good. We'll be looking forward to the midterm next week. At one of the meetings, I'll distribute the study guide for that midterm, and then you can start getting prepared for the exam itself. We'll have some review sessions leading up to that, so we're on our way towards that. But anyway, as long as there's no specific type of questions about that, I think it's all clear that today was the due date of our first essay, so thanks for your work, and now we'll get to work getting prepared for the midterm. Now we just have to do a couple more lectures on this ethics material. Last time I was going over the theory of Immanuel Kant's philosophy with you and his ethical system, so I kind of want to just refresh your memory about some of the major points there, wrap that up with one last concept, and then we're going to transition into the work of Peter Singer for today. So just me summarizing the Kant material one time. So we've learned a little bit about ethics so far in these past couple meetings. Ethics is the study of morality and study of moral concepts like right and wrong, good and bad, and generally speaking, what makes an action moral or immoral, morally permitted or morally impermissible. One theory was utilitarianism, which says that you should maximize the greatest amount of overall happiness for the greatest number of people. And a different approach is the view of Kant. So the first thing I told you about him is that instead of asking us to try and always act in whatever way would lead to the greatest overall happiness, Kant's system says that we should instead try to act with goodwill and with good intent. As long as we do act with the goodwill, then the consequences are irrelevant to the morality of the action. The goodwill is the only thing that one must have in order for their action to be defined as morally permitted. So, like I tried to provide one example in which a person does something with the best of intentions, but it leads to harm. If that was done, then a utilitarian would say because of the results that were negative for happiness, it was bad. And to a Kantian, because the intent was good and the will was good, then never mind the bad results, it was still not wrong or immoral. From there, we just try to give some sense of what this concept of the goodwill is. And to Kant, the goodwill consists in when you act from the motive of duty to uphold the moral law. Okay, and then there was this discussion of how the motive of duty is a slightly different motive than the motive of inclination. Only an act done from the motive of duty has moral worth, but an act that's done from the motive of inclination has no moral worth. Now, inclination is just having a desire or a want to do something, usually because of the pleasure you would get from it. And he's saying that even if you do something that's not wrong or even is in accordance with morality, it doesn't have any moral value if it's just done from inclination. The shopkeeper example helps to illustrate that. We imagine a scenario where a shopkeeper could give a fair price to a young child, and if he does it simply because he recognizes that it's right, even though he does not feel like doing it because his inclination is otherwise, then that shows that he acted with a pure goodwill, and that was his only motive. If he did it because he likes the child or because he likes the concept of feeling good from being fair, or because he's fearful of losing a competitive advantage from his other competing merchants if the fact gets discovered, then that's done from inclination, which is not based on morality. Now, from there, the last point was, well, what's the moral law? And how do we know what that is? Kant says by the use of reason, we can reveal what the moral law is. And when we use reason to try and contemplate the moral law, we descend upon what's called the categorical imperative. So the categorical imperative is Kant's terminology for the principle that you will use in order to determine which actions are forbidden by the moral law and which are required by it. So the moral law can be revealed by the categorical imperative. And the first version of the categorical imperative is what we kind of closed on last meeting. What it says is that you should always act so that the maxim which describes your action could be willed to be a universal law. So the maxim of an action is the principle behind the action, like I will do a certain act in some given circumstances. And when that is considered as a universal law, it simply gets converted into the statement that all people will do that action in the same circumstances. So what Kant asks is that you will only permit yourself to do acts that could be made into universal laws without either contradiction or undesirable outcomes. If everyone, let's say, if a person wants to cut a line, and their maxim is, I'll cut the line when the line's long, if that became a universal law, which says all persons will cut the line when it's long, then there would no longer even be a line to cut, and therefore that cannot be willed universally. So, long story short, categorical imperative version 1 says it's only morally permissible to do acts that would be possible for all to do alike, without the system either not being possible or being undesirable. Now, there's a second version of the categorical imperative that I also briefly hinted at as we were closing last time, and that's the one last thing that I want to kind of start us with today to wrap up the material for Kant. So, the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative is like the big major concept that ties Kant's ethical philosophy together. And I was mentioning that there are two versions of it. So I've just talked about the first one, which is the one about maxims and universal laws. Only act on a maxim that could be universalized. But the second version of the categorical imperative has a different look. And what it says is, never treat a human being as a means to an end, but always as an end in itself. Okay, so here it says, never treat human being as a means to an end, but always as an end in itself. Never treat a human being as a means to an end. Always treat human beings instead as ends themselves. Now, this statement, this principle, makes us go back to our understanding of the words means and ends, which we did touch on as we were going over the work of Mill. So let's see who can remember that. What is an end, in other words? The terminology of ends. What is an end? What is an end? Who knows? Just let me know in the chat. Means and ends. You may recall that Mill said that the only thing that humans pursue as an end is happiness. Okay, yeah, so it's the goal that you would want to achieve. And what are means? In comparison to the end, the means are the, well, Eva, a little too specific. Happiness is not always the goal. But to Mill, his argument was that happiness is the only thing that all of us seek as an end. I'm just asking about the word end itself. Forget happiness. What is an end? And it's correct to say that it is a goal. Okay? Now, what are means? What are those means? How you go about achieving the end. Yeah, the things that you do, the actions that you would take or whatever to get to the goal, to get to the end. So now we can go back and look at this again, having reminded ourselves about those things. It says, never treat a human being as a means to an end, but instead always as an end in itself. So in other words, when you're dealing with human beings, other fellow members of our human race, you have to treat another human being not as though they were just a instrument to be manipulated in order to attain a goal that you have set for yourself. You're supposed to treat human beings like they are the goal for the sake of which you're acting, instead of tools, instruments, stepping stones towards the achievement of a goal. So anyways, this means that you can't use people, exploit them, use force, fraud, or manipulation in order to arrive at some personal goal that you've got for yourself. And there's all kinds of cases where that is shown. Suppose that I would not do this, but suppose that somebody goes out and robs someone else. Just the act of theft, in this case robbery. When they rob the person and they take their money away, they're treating the individual that they've robbed as just a means towards the attainment of that little extra amount of money. So they're trying to treat the person kind of like a human ATM, not a human being that they are, instead just something to take from. So that bypasses the individual's will. It doesn't give them a choice in the matter of whether they would like to give the money as a gift or just a charitable act. So that's using it as a means to an end. If I have a friend and I only am really the person's friend because they're helping me with my homework or something, then maybe I'm using them as a means towards the real goal that I have, which is success in the class. If a person, horrifying example, but take the act of rape. If a person rapes somebody, that's a very clear case of using someone as a means to an end, because obviously they bypass consent and they're seeking the pleasure of the act without the person's willful consent. So obviously their body and person has been used as a means towards the end of the other individual's whatever pleasure seeking, as deviant as that is. What about our weird transplant scenario? You may remember that that was one of the cases used to explore objections to utilitarian theory. In that example, if you remember, the question was, shall the doctor kill the one innocent, healthy man in order to remove organs to save 5 others? And in utilitarian thought, it's hard to say why that's wrong, just because it seems to provide for the greater amount of overall happiness, since more people will survive if that act of murder is committed. But to Kant and his ethical system, now you see a far different look. It would not be permissible. Why? Because in doing that, what would you be doing to the one person who's been killed? Well, in the most graphic way possible, using them as a means to what end? To what end? To the end of the other people's survival and continued existence. But one human being cannot be used as a means to the end of other human beings, no matter how much more, let's say, utility could be generated by that. So what Kant says anyway is, human beings, we are rational, we recognize each other's rationality, so we owe it to each other to be treated as persons, not as instruments. If there was a horrifying emergency situation, like a mass shooting going on, and somebody ran to try and scatter towards safety, and let's say you were present at the scene, and this individual that's bigger and stronger even than you grabs you, puts you in front of them, and moves through the scene like that, and uses you as a human shield. Now, would that be okay? No. You know that if that was done to you, it would be an affront to your human dignity, because you're a person, not an object to be used as a barricade for incoming shrapnel or bullets or whatever. Now, if I do that to this table or something, I place that in front of me as a barrier, that's fine, because a table can be used as a means to an end because it doesn't have rationality and it doesn't have the ability to determine its own goals like another human being does. So if that was you, you'd know that you'd been treated wrong and that that was unjust. When you are the one who's dealing with other human beings, you owe them the same dignity and respect that you deserve in your dealings with humanity. So we shouldn't be treating each other as means to an end. That's the other way that Kant's categorical imperative is stated. And so if you're curious to know when and in what situations does a person use someone as a means, like, so what to avoid, Honora O'Neill, who was kind of the companion piece to our author Kant, which I did assign, she didn't have much additional to say. She just wanted to try and simplify his ethics a little bit, because obviously many people find it to be complicated. And her way of simplifying it was just to focus our mind on that second version of the categorical imperative. She says, when you really boil it down, it's just telling you not to ever involve anybody in an interaction that they would not consent to. So let me put that information up here. And this is still the categorical imperative here. But the principle affirmed by Honora O'Neill is simply this. You treat someone as a means. When you involve them in an interaction that they would not consent to. Okay, so in the case of the theft that I mentioned, like the example of robbery, the reason that that uses the person who's the victim as a means is because in that interaction, the victim of robbery doesn't consent to their role in the interaction. They're not like, hey, somebody come rob me, I would like for that to happen. So it's being done against their will pretty much. In the human shield case, once again, it's not like someone says, hey, do you need someone to block bullets coming in? Just use me as a shield. So it's not voluntary. It bypasses the rational will of the individual that's been exploited as a means. So, of course, rape is a very explicit case of that by definition. And so any action that's immoral, according to the moral law, as Kant would argue, is an act that involves you using some other person as a means, meaning that you involve them in an interaction that they would not consent to. Now, there's two versions of the categorical imperative. The one says only act on maxims that could be made universal. The other says don't treat human beings as a means to an end. Why are there two? Well, I guess Kant says that they're actually equivalent logically, so that although they look different on the surface, they lead to the same required action in every case. So any action that treats somebody as a means is also based on a bad maxim that could not be universalized, and vice versa. So every action based on a bad maxim that can't be made into a universal law also inevitably uses some person or persons as a means. Well, they're equivalent and they lead to the same outcomes, but he gives us these two because they can be used depending on the nature of the situation you're in more easily than the other. So when the interaction with other people is pretty immediate, like in the case of robbery or the human shield or whatever, then maybe the second version is easier to consider, like just logically. When the interaction with other people is more indirect or mediated, then maybe the first version, according to laws and maxims, is a little bit easier to think about. I think I talked to you guys about the case of the free rider who will jump the turnstile and take the subway ride without paying the fare or paying the toll. You might look at that and say, well, how is that using anybody as a means? The person's just doing it by themselves. But it does exploit all those who paid the fare as a means to the end of his ability to ride on it for free. So it just takes maybe a couple more steps logically to think about how one is used as a means when the interaction with other people is not immediate in the case mentioned. So however you prefer to think about it, you can just say that Kant is telling you never go into an interaction with people intending to do something with them that they would not agree to. If a person provides consent to be useful to you, then there's no exploitation. So don't misunderstand the second version here as saying any time where anybody is of use to you is immoral. No, it's only when they've been exploited as a means. We can and probably should be useful to each other, but doing so on the basis of our own voluntary decision to do that. So, you know, like when the barista makes you a coffee at Starbucks, are we using them as a means to the end of getting the drink? No, because they've chosen their role in the interaction by working at will, and they're free to stop working if they really don't want to take on the duties of the employment, which is to provide and serve these drinks. So that individual who serves you the drink does provide you with a good that you want, but they've not been exploited. On the other hand, if they were a slave or something, then that would be a whole different case, because of course the definition of slavery is it's forced bondage and servitude, and so the person is neither compensated nor given a choice whether they want to continue doing it. All right, so that's me just trying to sum up and give you one last look at Kant's philosophy here. About objections to Kant, so one objection to utilitarianism was that no action is totally ruled out. As long as it generates the most utility, everything is on the table, as it were. And that's definitely problematic to folks who think that there's some things that should just never be done categorically. Kant has, I think, a better way of looking at that kind of issue, because to Kant, there are forbidden actions. Like, it's never okay to use a person as a means to an end, no matter how much benefit could be derived from it. So Kant would not follow along in the transplant scenario and say one should kill the one innocent to save the five, because that would use the one person as a means. Where Kant's philosophy runs into some objections is that to some people anyway, it seems like it's a little too strict and high-minded. So it kind of has the opposite problem of not allowing us the permission to decline to do what the moral law obligates us to do, even if the consequences of doing that would be manifestly better. So Kant himself talks about a scenario where, say there was a person that you're trying to hide from a murderous adversary that's chasing them down, and that person asks you, are they here in your house? And at that time, your choice is tell them the truth, that they are here, but that puts their life at risk, in grave danger, or lie to the assailant and say, no, I don't know where they are, in which case he'll just move on and then the person's life will be protected. Now, Kant says that you cannot universalize the maxim which says that I will deceive somebody in order to attain some benefit or some goal. So that would be wrong, he says, to lie, even in that situation where obviously the consequences of the lie would be much better than the consequences of telling the truth. So Kant, sorry, there's a motorcycle out there. Kant can be criticized by being a little bit too strict in the way that he says we can't grant flexibility about the moral law. If you're looking at a situation where it seems like telling the truth is going to be causing a lot of harm, the moral law still commands you to tell the truth. Well, Drew, the thing about intention, I'm sorry to say, it's not what you think it is, according to Kant anyway. It's not just, I want to be helpful. To act with a good intention is to act from the motive of duty to uphold the moral law. It has nothing to do with making anybody happy. It has nothing to do with feeling good. It's strictly out of a sense of duty to the moral law that you do those things. So when one deviates from the moral law, even when they think they're doing it with the best of reasons or whatever, and with a righteous intent, it's not a goodwill if it can't be universalized. So, I mean, yeah, he would say that as he defines the goodwill, that's not really a goodwill. But anyway, thanks for that comment. That's a good one. So let's go ahead then. I guess we're done with Kant for now. We will return to some of those topics and talk about them again. But for the moment, we can clear this subject, and then we're going to start off with the next author in our lecture series. So from here, we're going to start to talk about an applied ethical issue. We've covered two ethical theories to this point. I'm just plugging my charger into the laptop here. Okay, so we've covered two big ethical theories, the kind of major ones, I think, in the West: utilitarian consequentialist ethics, and then the Kantian style, they call it deontological ethics. The word deontology is sometimes used in reference to theories that are similar to Kant's, which say that you have to obey moral rules out of a sense of duty regardless of the consequences. Just a very, very brief aside on that. Divine command theory is a very well-known ethical theory also. That's the one that says the moral obligation you have is simply to follow the commands of God. And so whatever God commands is morally obligated. Whatever God forbids or commands you to not do is morally impermissible. Now, how is that any way similar to Kant? Because in the same sense, both say that there are objective moral rules that are handed down to us either from the moral law that we discover by reason or by the deliverances of God, and we have an obligation to follow them no matter what the consequences would be. But there's some issues with the divine command theory that make it, I think, a little less kind of favored in the world of secular philosophy, because first of all, for anybody to follow divine command theory, they would have to already, of course, believe in the existence of God, and so it wouldn't have general appeal to everybody, since not 100% of people believe in God. And then the other issue is that it sometimes is confusing to people to try and interpret what God's exact message is to us in terms of what he commands and forbids us from doing. Surely there are the 10 Commandments, but then there's some ambiguity because there are other parts of the Bible which also seem to contradict things written in the 10 Commandments. For example, it says, "Thou shalt not kill," but then in Leviticus it says that he that blasphemeth the name of the Lord shall be put to death, and all the congregation shall stone him. Or that it also says in Leviticus that you shall not suffer a witch to live. So it seems like there's divinely requested acts of killing that are righteous, but then the general prohibition on killing. So it becomes a little hard for people to get clear moral guidance. And then the sort of even deeper philosophical issue with the divine command theory is that it raises this kind of conundrum. Does an act become moral just because God commands it no matter what? Or are there certain things that even God could not command to be moral because they're just too heinous? If the first thing is the case, then it seems like morality is arbitrary because God could make it moral to do just about anything. If it's the second case, and there's things that even God cannot arbitrarily assign moral or immoral, then it looks as if there's an independent source of morality and God is not the author of it. This kind of comes out a little bit in the parable of Abraham and Isaac. To anybody who knows a little bit about the Old Testament, there is this Old Testament story where Abraham, who was he received the covenant of God, and he was the one that was chosen by God to spread his message in the world, and that if he did that, he would secure a land for the Israelites where they could escape persecution in Egypt. And so he's like the emissary of God's word in the Old Testament. And he's considered the most allegiant to God, like the knight of faith. He's the most devout. One day, though, God wants to test his faith, and he says to Abraham, I have a command. I want you to kill your son Isaac. Now, that's deeply disorienting and confusing to Abraham, because he loves his son as anyone would. It's his, most valued thing in his life is his son and his relationship with his son. So he does not want to kill him. But on the other hand, he believes God is the Almighty, and anything God says, I have to do. So he takes his son. Does anybody know about this story and how it ends? I'm just curious to know. Sometimes people in these classes have at least studied some of these older Bible stories. If you do, you'll tell me in the chat, but I'll just continue to run through the last part of it. So Abraham takes Isaac up to the top of Mount Moriah, and he's prepared to slay his son. He doesn't exactly tell him what he's doing. He's like, let's go up the mountain. And so they go up there. At the last moment, Abraham stands over Isaac, and he's prepared to do this deed. But at the last moment, God substitutes Isaac for a ram, or some call it a lamb. Yeah, Cameron. And that becomes the offering to God in substitute of Isaac. So his son is spared. But it doesn't exactly resolve all the sort of puzzles philosophically about the story, because was God inevitably bound to replace Isaac with a lamb because it's just not something that's possible for God to make moral, the killing of one's children? Or could he have actually seen this through and made that the obligation of Abraham? If it's the first, that even God could not have made the killing of one's children morally obligatory. And it seems like morality has independent content, and it can't simply issue from the directives of God by fiat. If it's the second case, though, then it does seem like morality becomes arbitrary. Such a dastardly thing as killing one's own children could be considered morally permitted on that view. So anyway, the major alternative in Western philosophy to another deontological system is the writing of Kant. So anyway, we've covered now Kant, Mill, and I did a little bit of discussion on the side here about divine command theory. Now, we're going to try and use some of these theories to approach the debate of an actual applied ethical issue. So in ethics, there's kind of like ethical theory, which just gives like parameters and principles for judging the morality of actions. And then applied ethics is when you take some of these theories and you actually apply them to the facts of a real world issue, like the abortion debate, or in this case, economic inequality. So we're going to now look at the work of Peter Singer, and then when we finish with him on Monday we come back and we'll look at Garrett Hardin. And these two authors are going to have a kind of debate about whether we have an obligation to assist the absolute poor living in the third world. So Peter Singer makes the argument that citizens of the first world living in relative affluence have got a moral obligation to assist the global poor, perhaps by diverting some of our surplus wealth to the cause of hunger and poverty relief. Now that view that we have this moral obligation is not shared by everybody, and Garrett Hardin has the opposite take. His view is that we do not have a moral obligation to assist the global poor, and as Hardin argues, not only do we not have the obligation, but he thinks it's even furthermore counterproductive to the goal of ultimately fixing the problem of global poverty. So we're going to look at a kind of tale of two authors, and they have got far diverse different views on this one question: do we have an obligation to assist the global poor? So we start with Peter Singer, who gives the case that we do. All right, and as always in the class, there will be balance by the time we're done. You see both sides of the argument. So for now, here's the name of the author, Peter Singer. Peter Singer, and just opening the page to his topics here. Sorry, I just got to flip a bit. Yeah, so Peter Singer was born in 1946, and he's still living. In fact, he's probably considered one of the major living philosophers today, kind of a towering figure in the whole world of ethics. In the 70s, when he was a pretty young philosopher, he wrote this book that's become kind of a famous book, which is called Animal Liberation. And that book is all about the argument that we have some kind of ethical obligation to be vegetarian. And that actually was a very important book because the whole vegetarian movement and stuff was not as, I think, prevalent in the 70s when he wrote that, but it's gained a lot of traction today. So he's one of the kind of pioneers of the moral argument behind all of that. And he's taught at Princeton and a bunch of other influential, highly respected institutions. He still lives and works today. People could just email him if they really wanted to. He's quite friendly, but he's this Australian philosopher, one of the heavy hitters of the 20th and now 21st century. So in 93, he published this updated version of an older essay that he wrote in the 70s. And this is the paper we're going to study, which is all about the question of whether we have moral obligations to assist the third world poor. The paper in our book is just called Rich and Poor. So it's from 1993 by Peter Singer. It's called Rich and Poor. And again, it's making that argument that we have some moral obligation to assist the global poor. So to get that discussion started, I just kind of want to review with you guys some of the major points that he starts off with. So he begins just by discussing some general facts about poverty and like how many people in the world are suffering in the most dire condition of poverty and hunger. So even by conservative estimates, even by like a lowball estimate, and this is a 1993 figure, so today the numbers would be much larger, but at the time of writing, upward of 400 million people on planet Earth will lack the basic food and nutrition needed to just maintain their basic physical and mental health. Many people in this world right now are hungry and fighting off all kinds of opportunistic diseases and infections in hard-hit parts of the third world. And if you're living in that kind of economic condition, it causes a lot of people to die of starvation. Now, some people might not necessarily have the most sympathetic feeling towards the third world, but it's hard to turn a blind eye towards the case of little children who've really done nothing, of course, to deserve the situation that they're born into. And as we know, there's millions of children that die worldwide each year just from lack of adequate nutrition and food. Upward of 14 million at the time that he wrote this. And although I think the number stabilized a little bit after that, in the later 90s, we have a much bigger global population today. So it's relatively accurate still, that number. We here in the first world industrialized nations, especially the United States, which is the wealthiest country in the whole world, we don't really see the full scale of human poverty in our everyday lives. What poverty we do see, if we go out in search of it really, in our own communities, are, like the homeless, and certainly living in that type of condition in the first world is a tough situation to be in. But even our poorest of the poor, homeless people, like living on Skid Row, are still living in relative conditions of abundance compared to the poor people that we see in the third world. If you've seen some footage and you paid attention to how bad poverty and hunger can be in, like, I don't know, parts of like plains of Western Africa and stuff, you're going to see even little children and full-on adults looking like skeletonized, almost no meat on the bones, people sick unto death and literally starving. That's not really the case with the typical, Western industrialized nation homeless person. In fact, in some cases, there's enough surplus wealth and social assistance programs that a person even just panhandling for money and getting some like limited government assistance can still attain enough nutrition and resources to maintain a full frame or even a heavy set frame. So what's being mentioned is that there's just levels to poverty. And yes, there's a significant problem of poverty in some of our cities, but this does pale in comparison to the extremity of human suffering and poverty that you would find in the third world. So he mentions that. And he mentions to us next this phrase that was coined by a former U.S. Defense Secretary, Robert McNamara, in his travels and his experience. He coined the term absolute poverty. So absolute poverty is a pretty easy idea. It's just the situation of not having enough income or wealth to meet the basic human needs of three major things: food, clothing, and shelter. So not having enough income or wealth. To meet the basic human needs of food, clothing, and shelter. See the word needs? I know big Eddie there, but that just says needs right there. Basic human needs of food, clothing, and shelter. Absolute poverty. Now, this is termed absolute poverty rather than relative poverty, because sometimes some of us may even say that in comparison with people who have even more wealth, we feel like we're a little bit broke, or oh, I say I'm poor right now, I can't go out. But when we say something like that, we're speaking in relative terms compared to maybe the person in the mansion on the hill or whatever. I don't know what individual person's wealth situation, but of course there are levels to it, and you can imagine a person feeling a little poor in comparison to the most extravagantly wealthy. But the absolute poor are poor according to an absolute sense of basic human needs. So struggling to survive in an utterly degraded set of conditions, not only are you going to be struggling for enough food, but in parts of the world where this condition prevails, there's also poor public health, poor public sanitation, low literacy rates, and so a whole bunch of factors compound the dire situation that members of the third world find themselves in. And absolute poverty kills. Those that it doesn't kill, it makes their lives shorter and more miserable. People of all ages, including children. So he says then, when you look at just the numbers in 1993, there's about 1.2 billion people living in absolute poverty, 1.2 billion. And that's a major, perhaps a primary source of human misery across the globe. Now, today it's 2020, and so the number 1.2 billion is definitely larger now just because the whole global population has significantly expanded since then, and the problem hasn't gone away or anything. So if anything, when he gives these numbers in his 1993 paper, an updated version of the paper would just have larger figures. So Peter Singer thinks of himself as a utilitarian ethically. And since we've learned now a little about utilitarianism, you can connect these dots. He believes that means that what we should be doing ethically is trying to act in a way that create the greatest amount of overall happiness for the greatest number of people. But absolute poverty, which is a real life world condition, is taking happiness away and creating pain, misery, and death. So it's not what any utilitarian should want. And he thinks that according to utilitarian moral principles, people should have some motivation to try and at least do something to remedy the situation or improve upon it at least marginally. Now in philosophy, as you guys have started to learn, there's often a lot of discussion of hypothetical scenarios. We ask you, oh, consider, like this hypothetical, there's an island, there's people on it, they're trying to determine if they should follow the hidden emperor, and all of that is kind of just conceptual work to get you to think about the features of, an argument. I know that sometimes students studying philosophy can find it frustrating because, I don't know why, I like the stuff, but some people find that it's a little sometimes detached from everyday concerns, or that it can seem somehow fantastical or abstract. Well, anyway, in this paper at least, we're not talking about anything abstract or hypothetical. This is a real world situation that persists right now. And it's kind of like a background condition that's always there. It's not something that's there sometimes and then it goes away for a while and comes back. Absolute poverty is not going to take a break any day of the year. It's always there. It's something that we don't always think about or pay attention to because it doesn't always make headlines in our own domestic news media. We're oftentimes more preoccupied with political affairs or other events that are more relevant to our domestic concerns as United States citizens. But we should not assume, and Singer mentions this, that everything is going well in the world when we just don't hear any reports of like an aviation disaster or something going wrong in our own country. That's a persistent problem, and it would sometimes require us to take a deliberate effort to go out of our way to look at the facts because they're not necessarily served up to us on a platter in our everyday news and media consumption. So anyway, some argue that the problem of absolute poverty can't be fixed, and Singer wants to try and disagree with that and show you why he does not agree with that statement. Some people think it's futile to even make the argument that we should do better because it's just inevitable that this problem can't be fixed. Why do people say that? Well, some people think that it's a problem of scarcity of resources, that with a world, with a global population as large as ours, and with scarce and dwindling resources, it's inevitable that not everybody is going to be able to get as many of those resources as they need for healthy and stable survival in the long run. So some people think that, as sad as it is, we should not be made to feel like we can do anything, because when you have too many people and not enough resources, some are just not going to get as much. If you guys ever remember the old game of musical chairs, it's like when the music stops, everyone has to sit, but there's not enough chairs for everybody, right? And if there's too many people and not enough chairs, not everyone gets a seat. So it's a metaphor, but someone could argue that the situation of global hunger across the world is somewhat similar. If there's too many people and just not enough food, essentially, then there's nothing to be done, and some people, unfortunately, are not going to get a seat at the so-called table, in that sense, not being able to eat as much or have enough. But Singer does not agree with that. So here's Singer now telling you why he does not agree with that analysis. He says the problem is not really a problem of scarce resources, though. As he argues, the problem is a problem of waste, mismanagement, and poor distribution of the available resources. So let me erase here the stuff that I've got on the board so I can create some more notes. Eddie's being such a good kitty today. I love this. You know, he sometimes is walking around trying to play with me, but he's just watching the lecture today, which is like so cute. Okay, anyway, Singer now speaks and says this principle. The problem of global hunger is not a problem of scarcity of resources. It is instead a problem of waste and inefficient use of available resources. So he's saying not scarcity, instead waste and maldistribution. So it's a distributive problem, he thinks, rather than a problem of scarcity. Now, why does he say that? Okay, so there's some evidence to sort of back his position here. First of all, waste. So we in the Western world actually do waste a lot of consumable resources. A lot of the food that we have goes straight into the landfill, either because we buy surplus amounts that we then have to throw out eventually, or we just buy more food that we eat on the plate. So if we were a little bit more in line with conserving what we consume and not getting more than we need, there would be so much savings in terms of consumable resources that would make a big impact on the overall availability of consumable resources for the global population. And the second point about poor distribution is one that he actually emphasizes even a little more. So it's been pointed out, and Singer's aware of this, the science here, that our heavy reliance on a sort of meat-based animal agriculture diet in the West and globally causes there to be an inefficient distribution of consumable resources, because what we've learned is that the amount of consumable resources that you have to divert to, let's say, livestock, cattle, to bring them up to the market as production for meat could more efficiently be distributed directly to human beings to provide for human food and resources. So essentially, if we relied less on animal-based diet, then there would be such a savings in consumable resources that are otherwise diverted to cows and pigs, that we could actually feed a global population even larger than the current population and solve the problem of hunger. Now, it might not surprise you that Peter Singer, the author of the whole animal liberation book, would make this argument, but there's some scientific evidence behind it. Now, he's not saying let's have a worldwide conversion to vegetarianism and save the planet in terms of hunger, because he knows that that's not realistic, but he's pointing out, though, that it's not literally impossible or inconceivable for us to make changes to the status quo that improve on the problem, and many of us just don't do those things, either individually or socially as a collective. So he's just refusing to let us off the hook, essentially. He's saying, don't say that there's nothing that could be done, and so it's a futile struggle against poverty. There are things that could be structurally changed or at least modified that would make an improvement, but we're just not doing them, so he lays a little of the blame at our feet and says that it's really more about that maldistribution and waste than the literal scarcity of available resources. So how to fix the problem, or how to at least improve on it, one thing he says would be to divert some of the additional surplus wealth that we have in the first world to the third world to help improve on it. And that's when he introduces the term absolute affluence, which is like the flip side of absolute poverty. So I know we're running a little short in this lecture. It's scheduled for 2 meetings, so we're definitely still on track. I guess I'm thinking about how much more I can say or should say with a few minutes that remain. But I'll just do this. I'll define for you absolute affluence, and then that'll be the last definition for this, this current meeting. So in comparison to absolute poverty, there's absolute affluence, and that's a straightforward definition because it's simply the reverse of the other definition. It's having more than enough income or wealth to meet the same basic needs of food, clothing, and shelter. Okay, so based on the way this definition is provided, that's all of us. All of us, you know, first world citizens in the United States, or in some cases we have some international students, but speaking to this group here in Chapman, it's clear, right? We have more than enough income or wealth to meet the basic human needs of food, clothing, and shelter. So it's not as if all of your income and wealth is diverted towards the essential things that you need. Like after you buy food, somewhere to sleep at night, and some clothes on your back, you have nothing left over. Everything's poured into that so that you don't have any money to spend on yourself, for fun, for leisure, for entertainment. That's definitely not any of our case. Some of us have more or less money than others, but in all of our case, just by the very fact of like my institutional role and yours at this university, we know that we still have money after we get those basic things taken care of to buy, you know, new clothes, entertainment, technology, video games. It used to be concerts and stuff, but not so much anymore. But you get the picture, right? There's a lot of non-essential things that we buy, not things that we need, but that we just want. And we do that with the surplus wealth that we have because we are members of the first world living in absolute affluence. So we have income beyond the basic necessities. And if we compare and contrast that to the sake of the case of the absolute poor, you see these big disparities. So we're going to pick up with that on Friday. There's a little more in Peter Singer's article to go over, but we're making good progress on it. So for now anyways, guys, I guess I'll let you go. Thanks again for being here at the meeting. And like I said, after I'm done with my 10:50 hour, the next hour, I'm going to go through my emails, and I'm just going to tell everybody, you know, thank you for your essay and confirm the receipt of your essay. So look out for my confirmation message to you in the next hour and a half. And other than that, just have a good day, and I'll see you back on Friday. Okay, everyone. Thank you.